Good evening, Michael. I am Dr. Ramala Sharma, an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy, Nagaon College Autonomous, Assam, India. So today, I'm going to talk about your work, Fearism. Actually, I was introduced to this concept in 2021 when you wrote the article for my edited volume titled Calling Philosophy from Fear to Fearlessness, a Global Emergency. In my book, Understanding Mind, Consciousness, and Person, published in 2021. So it was the first time that I got to learn about fearism. So after that, I read several articles written by you and Deshuba also. Yeah. In the meanwhile, Deshuba sent me his book, Philosophism. I read that.
Okay.
And finally, I read your book, Philosophy of Fearism, a primer.
Okay,
so
good.
After reading that, so I thought that now, yes, I'm ready to hear more from you. Please. Okay, nice. So please tell me about fearism in brief for the beginners so that I can let my students know about it.
Sounds good. So I'm Dr. R. Michael Fisher, and great to meet you for the very first time in actual image. We've talked on emails for, I think, a year and a half or two, off and on, and really appreciate that not only you're from a Department of Philosophy, I appreciate that you are appearing to be a woman. I think you self-identify as a woman. Is that correct or not?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's my privilege.
And I think that's important for me, as I mentioned before, that it's very rare I find that women are interested in fearism. And so that's what we're talking about today, folks, just so that you can see.
Yeah.
Fear with that ISM on the end makes all the difference. And then I was hearing that you did a paper as you introduced yourself on fear to fearism.
Fear to fearism, yes.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting way of placing and juxtaposing those two ideas. So in fact, my story very briefly, and we'll just start with the real simple idea of fearism, and then it's like a simple idea is, of course, very complex. It has many layers to unfold, and hopefully your questions today will be a good lead into that beginning. And I'm glad you read that book, which I showed, the primer for fearism, the philosophy of fearism. It's a good start. It's a little book, and it's a summary. So fear to fearism is exactly what happened in my own thinking. Interesting enough, back in 1989, when I started to become interested in to study fear as a factor, a vector, a major contributor to human behavior. That would be the simple end. Motivation, of course, are many and complex. You can ask me questions about why I would do that. But so that was the beginning. And then it was very quickly into 1990. So in 1989, I started this project. I started it under the label of In Search of Fearlessness project for the planet. And that was me and another woman who come up with this idea, and we founded that concept. We didn't trademark it or anything. We just thought it was like a liberation project for humanity. So a big vision from a visionary experience. But fear, the fearism, the very first time I can see that I wrote it down is in 1990, and I basically defined it as very similar to terrorism. But instead of
Oh,
using terrorism, I used fearism. And that was a very conscious placement because I figured that fear, talking about fear, was not enough by itself unless we understood fear within philosophical, ideological, political discourse and containers. Just like instead of talking about race, or we could talk about sex, if you don't add the ism, right? If you're only talking about sex and not sexism, if you're only talking about race and not racism, you're going to get a very narrow view of what race is about, or what sex is about, or what fear is about. So that's what I was playing with. I like that idea of adding ISM. It just expanded the thinking and the possibilities for what I call a good fear studies. So my very simple definition was fearism is the subtle belly, in a way, the hidden part of terrorism. Terrorism is only the extreme manifestation after a lot of experiencing fearism. So fearism in that way is basically the use of fear to use it as a form of power, or weaponizing it, the experience of fear, against another. And of course, could be against yourself. And usually they go together. So that's really what the fearism idea was in the original form. And so we can talk about how that changed when I met Desh Suba in 2014. That changed
yes.
and got modified, which I'm sure you've read about in the book.
Yeah. So I would like to know what exactly, is there any incident or anything that instigated to work on fear studies? Is there any incident?
Yeah, there's many. And, I won't go back into a long story, but, I would say my mother influenced me as a young boy. She was
Okay.
a war bride from Belgium, out of Europe. Country was occupied by the Nazi Third Reich regime for 3 years. She was a teenager. She was terrified, tortured. She's not Jewish, but they took over her entire country, and she's a 17-year-old beautiful woman. So you can imagine soldiers on the streets with rifles, and they can do whatever they want with the people, and they did. And so my mom has told me little bits of stories growing up about that experience, which was hard to understand as a teenager here in Canada, where I live and born. But I picked up from her this great, deep, anxious, paranoid quality to her life and her personality. And not surprising. There was all kinds of incidents of abuse that went on for her. But she came to the new country, had children, had a family, married my father here, Canadian. So I would say that's the deep motivation. Why is my mom so neurotic? Why is she so
Oh,
terrified of every other, right? Always looking over her shoulder, not trusting anyone for the most part. And yet she wanted to be loving. So here's sort of the key. She wanted to be loving. She wanted to love us children. But I could see, and I grew up to see, her woundedness, her trauma from that incident and many others within her family and her generation. She was also working poor class. And there's so much hurt and injury due to oppression. And that I could see her love was not, to me, very pure. It was distorted, and it was often self-grabbing and needy, and etc. So I just, as a young boy, I picked that up. I could see my mom struggle. I felt her struggle. I felt her being called a displaced person in Canada because she was a foreigner, immigrant, right? She has an accent. She speaks with an accent, even if she's sort of pretty white. No, ethnocentrism exists. It's another form of oppression. And oh, you're
Yeah.
not normal. You're not speaking English like everybody else. And my mom cried and cried. Her job, she got fired. Because she got in fights with people because they would treat her as a displaced person. So that was the beginning. But then the real kickoff, much later in life, was several powerful experiences with, I'll say, intimate women others that I've had. So that included my first wife, for example. And these are relationships that were based on this love and idealism, right? The beauty of all that attraction and romance and everything. And we're going to build a family. And then I watched fear destroy love. So when I watch that, I'm like watching very carefully and I'm going, this is like my mother. This is like other people. This is like the problem of love. And the problem of love, I found deeply as I analyzed all these years, is really a fear problem. And until we solve the fear problem, I don't think we're going to deal with the love problem very well. So there's my quick short story.
Nice story. Okay. So in your book, I saw fear plus. Fear plus. Could you elaborate what fear plus is? And next, what I would like to know from you is by capital letter fear. So would you like to mean it's something that transcends the experience or the feeling of fear which we generally experience?
Yeah. So
these two things. One is fear plus, and the other is
capital
by capital letter. Yes,
yeah.
yes. That I can
Right.
see.
And then fear plus, I will sometimes write. So
Okay.
thanks for bringing that out. I'm not surprised you would do that as a philosopher. Most people would not pick up on that and or care about it, but a good philosophical critical thinker will say, well, what kind of concept is that? Why the plus? So let's start with that.
Yeah.
So the plus really is very similar in example to what fearism is. So fearism is fear plus something.
Yes.
So another example would be fearology. Fear plus, I add the
Plus.
ology, which means the study of fear in relationship to life. So that's my definition of fearology. Another word I coined, even though some other people have used it very loosely in popular culture, I academically used fearology. Well, between Desh Suba from Hong Kong, and he's a Nepali writer and philosopher and poet,
Yeah.
and he writes a lot about fear, more than anybody I know, and me and him are probably writing the most about it. We write it from an idea of a transpersonal, not just transpersonal, but transdisciplinary is what I really want to say.
Yes.
A transdisciplinary perspective, meaning not just within the bounds of psychology, of biology, right, of understanding fear and naming it, labeling it, defining it, giving it meaning within those contexts. So both Desh Suba and I took off and said, well, we don't want to restrict the idea of fear. So notice I said idea of fear. I didn't say just an experience of fear. That's a huge difference in language. So when you move fear to an idea and not just an experience, i.e. in your emotional sweating response, heart rate, all those things that we would normally say, oh, that's a fear, you're having fear, that's a fear. Or you have a fear of spiders, or you have a fear of this. No, you can see Desh Suba and I, because we follow this idea of fearism, which we can talk about the philosophy of fearism, is an expansion. So it's another fear plussing to make fear capable of being embraced into all the different disciplines. And we want to study all of those in fearism studies, right? From architecture of fear to geography of fear to philosophy of fear, psychology of fear. I could go on and on. And that makes fear a lot different than what it used to be. So you can see fear plus is a signature. It's a quick way to identify We're not just talking about normal fear here, as we would define in the dictionary or an encyclopedia of medicine or something like that. So the capital F goes on easily when you do a transdisciplinary study of fear. It's easy to then make, well, fear is so huge now because it's across all these domains of knowledge and knowing. We might as well make it a capital. And that just makes us also think, oh, fear with a capital F. How is that different than fear with just an ordinary small f? So it's not that we're making it a noun by the capital. We're not doing that. It's not just a noun. We're making it an entire different idea. So it kind of represents the idea of fear. Capital I.
Yes.
Okay.
Capital. Okay. So next, what is the similarity and dissimilarity between Fisherian fearism and Shubian fearism?
Yeah.
That is my query, not question actually.
Yeah. So I'll just write Suba.
Similarity and dissimilarity.
Yeah. So you're talking about Subaian, what I label.
Yes.
And that is Desh Suba. Desh Suba is the founder of the philosophy of fearism. So he put that phrase together, philosophy of fearism, together. He did that in his 2014 book, his major first work. You have the Trans Philosophy book, which is his third book in the trilogy of books, but the first one is the Philosophy of Fearism, 2014. So again, he's a very philosophical minded person. He is what I call an organic intellectual. He is not in the academy. He's not interested to be in the academy. He is what I would call an on the ground, in the world philosopher, organic intellectual. And I love that. I love that thinking because he's not captured. He's not controlled by disciplines. He's not controlled by the academy and all the training like I am to become a PhD. And so he's very freewheeling. And I love that thinking of someone who thinks so freewheeling. So what's different between his idea is you have to understand Desh Suba came up with the word fearism independently of me. I said I came up with it in 1990, my first writing, although I didn't do much after that until quite later. But I did name it and I did define it back then. And Desh Suba in 1999 ended up using the word when he was trying to figure out literary criticism to go into a new direction. He says, well, there's literary criticism, you can use things like existentialism. And so you can analyze literature through an existential viewpoint, right? Or a rationalist viewpoint. You can understand it through an aesthetic viewpoint. And that's how you can do literary criticism under these various lenses. And he says, well, I think we should be analyzing, and he has lots of good reasons for this. We should be analyzing literature, doing literary criticism through the lens of fear. Yes. And so he then he did a fear plussing, and he called it fearism. He says, I'm going to call this fearism. We can analyze literature through this lens of how fear works in the stories, right? And in the ideas in a novel, in a piece of poetry, or whatever. And then you as a writer, a creative writer, could also use that lens of fearism and write literature and create works of art through that same lens. So he was really trying to bring in a brand new way to do literary criticism. And in Nepal, he got a lot of publicity. In Nepal, not around the world, but he did in Nepal within the writers community. So I always want to say that congratulations to him coming up with a new idea. And then eventually he turned that idea into a whole philosophy. Just like you'd have a philosophy of rationalism or a philosophy of existentialism, he said, I'm going to write a philosophy of fearism. That's what he said. And that's his 2014 book. Myself, I focus more on the political. I focus more on that original idea of philosophy, fearism like terrorism. So I had a much negative or more dark side to fearism. His philosophy of fearism is a much brighter side. He acknowledges fear can have a downside, right, and be negative and have horrible consequences. Yes, he does. But he's got this whole huge, very positive, very optimistic view of fear is essential. It is part of life. We will never get rid of it, and we shouldn't get rid of it. We should learn how to work with it, right, in a more conscious way. So that's just a surface of our differences. And yet, when I met him, I said, I agree with you too. And so we talked, and I said, well, why don't we combine and kind of make a combination? So I realized my definition of fearism wasn't big enough. That's what came out when I met him. And I went, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. So I'm going to expand my own definition of fearism. So we often have co-written, and you can see we're both similar, but we're a little different. Anyway, that's a beginning of what it would take. So you'd have to read and study a bit more to figure out our differences, but that's a start.
Yes, sure. Thank you so much. Somewhere you said that it is a serious problem not to have a feminine perspective within the purist camp of thought. Am I right?
Yes.
So how can purism be an important subject in feminist studies?
In feminist studies? Yeah.
Yeah.
Women's studies, right? Just even general, right? Yeah, for sure. So I just will start with a little background. My partner, Barbara Bickle, was a professor in gender and women's studies at a university in the United States. It's about 10 years ago. And at one point they were doing this brown bag talks, and they bring in speakers for the women and gender studies students. And I was saying, well, I'll come in and do a talk on fear in women. And I did. And I wrote a little paper about it. It's a technical paper, which is online. It's called Women in Fear. And I was very interested to watch the women's eyes. They were like, who's this male guy, white guy, talking about fear in women? And what does he have to say about anything? It went over okay, but it was like I could tell they were cautious about me talking about a subject like fear. When I wasn't a psychologist, I wasn't a therapist, right? I was talking as a kind of a philosopher, an educator, which I'm trained in education, a PhD in education, but I'm a much broader thinker than that. So it came basically down to, I think there is not enough conversation and research, especially in the fearism researchers. So people followed Desh's work. They followed a bit my work. Desh much more successfully. He found all kinds of people to follow his work. I didn't here in the West. And I think in the East, there's just way more openness to it. To be honest, there's more open-mindedness. You are here interviewing me from the East. And I'm going, there's a reason for that. There's a reason that is not happening in the West very much. They're not so keen. And especially women are not keen at all in the West to ask a man, oh, what do you think about women in fear? No, they don't want to know, because I think they already think they know. And they know a lot, but I don't think they know a lot. I think they know some, and it's very important. But as a fearist or a fearism philosopher, I'm very interested to expand our knowledge of fear for everybody. Doesn't matter what gender you are, what race you are, what doesn't matter. I think we're all undereducated in the concept and the idea of fear. Not just see fear management physiologically or psychologically. I'm talking about the idea of fear. We're undereducated At every level, I would be very surprised there's any culture in the world that starts a good fear education with their children. I think it's very happenstance. It's like it doesn't have any curriculum. I've never seen a curriculum. I'm a curriculum person, so I look for curriculum. I don't see it. And so fear in women and fearism, particularly in our group, they're all men. All men are writing about fearism, the philosophy of fearism at this point. And that's disastrous. I know one other woman, and she's in Nepal, a professor, a young professor, much like you. And, she's a Nepali born as well. And she's saying, we need to have women in there. We need to have feminists in there talking about fearism. And I says, well, bring it on, bring it on. Right, right. Publish. I'll try to help you. So that's the story of there is a complete shortage of women in this area. And I'm not pleased about it. And I have spoken out and you know, the guys, the men, they like to write their way and they like to do their stuff. It's not like they're against women. I don't find that. It's just they're doing their own thing. So I have definitely invited, and as you saw it in the book, that philosophy of fearism primer, I said, let's have more females, and or transgendered, etc., queer. We need
Yes.
all perspectives. That's the whole methodology of fearism, and Desh Suba agrees. The the very methodology is to be multiple perspectival on understanding this idea of fear and fearism.
So next question is fear in human development. So would you like to include this subject in curriculum? Do you have any plan? Because if we do not apply it or use it in curriculum, probably it cannot have its real significance. Okay. So my question is, how does fearism explain the role of fear in human development and personal growth? Specifically, how can understanding and addressing fear contribute to the nurturing of creativity, freedom, and human development in individuals, holistic development in individuals?
Well, it's a big question and it's very complicated. But I will start with, as I've said, we do not have a good fear education in our school systems.
Yes.
Fearism is saying that. That is the theory. It's in the theory of fearism, it's in the philosophy of fearism that we are undereducated. Now, that would be the same analogy, fear education, as sex education. So if I came along and said, we need more sex education, that should be universal across curriculum, K to 12 and up into post-secondary education. So I'm saying, and the philosophy of fearism supports that. There's no other philosophy, there's no other theory I know of that says we ought to do that. There's lots of people talking about fear and how to, learn techniques to overcome fear, right? So that it doesn't inhibit your human potential, so that you get to risk, you get to try things. That's all the psychology of fear. So all, unfortunately, probably 98% or more of the discourses and the conversations about fear that flow in and out of education systems, formal or informal, is all the psychology of fear. Or now neurobiology of fear, which is very popular. Oh, how does the brain, what's going on with, brain scans, and that tells us about what fear is. All of that is reduction, as we call in philosophy. It's a reductionism of methodology, of disciplinarity, of a type of management to put knowledge in this box around fear. And that's all you need to know. Fearism comes along and says, no, we're going to blow that box up. All those borders and boundaries of regular, normalized definitions we are saying are not normal doesn't mean better. So in other words, what we normally understand about fear and teach about fear is not necessarily better. It's not necessarily holistic, as you say. It's not necessarily going to lead to a liberative, emancipatory thinking where a consciousness is free to explore knowledge and speak out and have voice to speak what I need to speak. Because if you don't have that freedom, in one way or another, you're being controlled by toxic, excessive, weaponized fear, sometimes called a culture of fear.
Yes.
So domination exists in knowledge production. Domination exists in education at all levels, is the argument that Desh Subadai would make, and that philosophy of fearism is a path. It's leading to a different way to expand your thinking and criticality, your critical literacy on knowledge about fear. When it comes to you, somebody says, oh, this is what you need to know about fear, whether it's a book or a lecture or your parents telling you, or your sister or your brother, and they're saying, oh, this is all you have to do about fear, and you're going, well, thanks for the information, but you don't go, oh, that must be the truth, and that must be the best information. And Dal Desh Subin and I are saying, well, the philosophy of fearism is saying there's a lot more information than that normal, that normal way, that common way of understanding fear, so-called common sense knowledge. So it is liberating. It is liberating to expand. To move to Fear Plus is a liberating move. It's a maneuver, it's a strategy, and that's not, as I said, just about managing fear. That is about becoming an understanding of fear that's critical consciousness.
Yes. So in what ways can fearism be applied to modern educational systems to create environments that can minimize fear and foster emotional and intellectual growth?
Yeah.
And again, one more, what strategies and practices would you like to recommend for the educators to help students transcend fear and develop a fearless mindset?
Yeah. So let's do the first question first. You might have to remind me of the second one. In organizations, all organizations, I mean, think of every group organization. I mean, every group organization has all its power politics within it. Certain people dominate the conversation. Their ideas dominate decision-making, even if we're democratic and voting on issues. But who has the most voice? Who has the most input? Who's allowed? That is a politics of knowledge. That's a politics of power. That is in every group and every organization. Every sociologist with any worth would say, yes, you got to watch how power moves in groups and in social structures. So all institutions, organizations have the ability to basically put in a policy. This would be an example of a strategy, a practice as well with this strategy. And so if I was a consultant, I went into a corporation and they were saying, okay, you're a fearologist, you have this fearism idea, what can you do for our organization? I would say, well, put in a policy, let's start there, that fear is an important factor in everything we do in this organization and in your personal life. So fear is an important factor. And then I would go further to say, fear is not just a factor. So that's the first step. Fear is a factor. Just to get that, put that in your policy. And then I would go to the next one and say, and we have to look at the culture of fear within this organization in a critical, self-reflective way. That will be part of our policy. That will be part of our conversations in this organization whenever it needs to be brought up. So it's not going to be a taboo topic, which is like sex. You just can't bring up issues of sexism in an organization that doesn't want to hear about gender difference and sex difference, that we don't want to hear about that. Just be a good worker. Don't bring that up. That's messy. And don't bring it up if you're a woman or a transgender. Don't bring it up, especially. And so you can see we're challenging here, right? The way knowledge is organized in an organization of any kind, even liberation organizations aren't always open to the conversation about these things. So that would be my first consulting move. So maybe if you want to go to your second question.
So you think that peer studies can bring social change? No doubt. Peer studies can bring social change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we don't have peer studies, right? We don't in our academic, there's no academic institution that has something called peer studies. We have, we have all kinds of studies. We have religious studies, we have Black studies, we have, Islamic studies, whatever. We have all kinds of studies out there. And I'm just saying, fear is so important in the human experience. We need a fear studies, and we need to bring in all these different researchers creating this really rich knowledge base where students can access that and learn how they want to respond and relate to fear for the rest of your life, professionally and personally.
So would you like to include it as a part of philosophy, like existential philosophy, or would you like to make it a quite different discipline?
Yeah, I would like to make it a transdisciplinary discipline. For example, there's cultural studies. That's arisen in the last couple decades. That's a very broad topic. Cultural studies, wow, and it's transdisciplinary. It's not just anthropology anymore. It's wide open to be influenced by all knowledges. I took courses in cultural studies, and I started thinking, we need a fear studies that has that same attitude of that openness. And that would be great for us to understand fear in a better way. So that's the main thing. In philosophy itself, I would love to see at least some part in the curriculum in all philosophy courses. There is something called philosophy of fearism. Let's have that in the discussion. It's as important, arguably, as existentialism, as rationalism, as any of the other isms that philosophy studies. And it just doesn't have to be the whole course, but it could just be a section for open discussion.
Yes. So if I just suppose I want to approach authority or college authority that I'd like to include this subject in our curriculum.
Yeah.
So what should be the best approach for me so that they don't mock at me? It is nothing to study like this. So what should be the best approach?
Well,
they may say that it may be included in psychology because fear is one of the emotions. Yeah. Why do you want to include it in philosophy when psychology is there? So what should be my best approach?
Yes, it's a great question. It needs a lot of thought. So there is I think a good approach and not so good approach. So let's just look maybe at what might be my ideas for a good approach to bring that to a philosophy department. First of all, I have seen in a philosophy department in a university, top good university in America, when I was down there, they had a conference this graduate students put on. And the graduate students put up this on, and the topic theme was fear. So the graduate students got together, they went and looked who writes about fear, and they pulled people from mostly philosophy, but also from psychology, also from literature. And they had this interdisciplinary conference. The theme was fear for 3 days. It was great. They published the articles after that. The graduate students got to publish some articles. So rather than sort of pushing the fearism per se, pushed just fear as a theme. It's a theme because it's important to humans. And there's a lot of writing and thinking that is beyond psychology of fear. That's one of the things you have to convince your department. And you have to show that literature. There's studies in architecture of fear, geography of fear, philosophy of fear, etc. And so when you line up that literature and you show, oh, we can't just talk about fear as an emotion anymore, because it's crossed outside of, it's expanded outside of the discipline of psychology and medicine. Remember, medicine and psychology are like this: psychiatry, medicine. And so that has a lot of power, right, to control what we think about fear. And a good philosopher would say, oh, okay, well, that's interesting, but why should medicine and psychology and biology control how we understand fear? Why should it? That's the philosophical question. So to me, that's like you're just wanting philosophers to practice questioning knowledge. So here's where you get, I find a good route would be, we want to look at the epistemologies of fear. There's a philosophical question, inquiry. So if you say, let's have at least something in our department on epistemologies of fear, and of course that can include ontologies of fear, etc. But if you start that, that's different than fear management. That's why if you say, I want to do something on epistemologies of fear in your philosophy department, and they say, well, they're not going to say, oh, that's the psychology department. See, if you don't bring that in, they're going to think, oh, it's just about feelings and emotions. Yes. Yeah, philosophers have been philosophizing about emotions, as you know, and for a long, long time, way, way back. But the fearologists, the fearism people like myself and Deshuba, we say fear is no longer just an emotion. That is our fundamental premise for our work. That's why it's transdisciplinary. That's why we call it fear plussing. It's got all of those elements of an expansion of thought. And that's where I mentioned earlier, and I will suggest there is a good book out there. It's called Fear as an Idea. Let's see. I'll send the link to you. It's by a political historian, philosopher out of New York University, and it's called Fear, the Politics of an Idea. And when I saw that title, 2004, he wrote that, very top-notch scholar, wonderful job he did, follows the different philosophers through history of the last 200, 300 years in modernism here, at least in the West. And he traces the philosophers who talked about fear, and he frames it as an idea moving through history of thought. Right? This is the philosophy of ideas. That's a genre in philosophy that ought to be respected. And so the idea of philosophy is a good language to use, again, to get around, oh, are we going to talk about feelings? Are we going to be talking, well, that's psychology department. And you say, no, we're talking about philosophy as an idea. And it has a historical trajectory, and it has biases within that trajectory of idea. And philosophers, their job is to challenge ideas. I think that's a way I would approach it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I have learned a lot from you. Thank you.
Yeah, so I know you asked a question about fearlessness at one point, or the fearless condition. And
yes.
I will just briefly say that those are words that I use, both fearlessness and fearless. I use them in a very carefully constructed philosophy and theory. I do not throw them out as an easy term or a simple term. There's reasons for that, because my study of those terms shows there's a long history behind those practices. Example, Mahatma Gandhi, when he uses fearlessness, based upon the Bhagavad Gita, for example, the wisdom traditions. Fearlessness is a very complex construct. It is the construct he used for nonviolence. He used that construct for liberation and the practice of how to not get yourself caught in other people's fear. In other words, your enemy. And he was using that concept at the basis of his peace movement for liberation in India, because he didn't use love. I mean, he would say love or use, but it wasn't the core training concept. Fearlessness was the actual concept for the training for the peace movement that he was a major leader of. And I just think that's so right on. And it's something I always remember. I am teaching about the path of fearlessness. So when I say fear studies, I'm not interested in fear studies just for academic reasons.
Yeah.
And I think you'll see that in all my work. Desh Suba also agrees. He just doesn't focus on fearlessness like I do. I specialize in fearlessness and what that really can mean and the practices for it. So I basically say, if you want to understand fear, you have to understand fearlessness. If you want to understand fearlessness, you're going to have to understand fear really well.
Yes.
So that's kind of my play.
Yeah. Do you use any practice to heal fear?
Yeah. I mean, a big part of the practice for healing my fears and or traumas that I have, and I always say the worst fear comes from a hurt. The worst fear, the most destructive fear comes because we've been injured and we have not healed that injury. All the other little fears, they're minor. They have some impact. Even the fear of death is like when you're traumatized, you feel like you're going to die. Trauma reminds you you're dying and you could lose your life. You're losing your integrity as a human being in a traumatic experience. So that's why the healing liberation has to go together. So one of the simple practices that I do the most, I says, if you want to work with fear and begin the healing and this transcending, as you talk about, or the moving toward fearlessness, same ideas, is to work in the communal, work with others. Why? Because we are a social species. Humans are incredibly social. We're not just individual agents. And that's been a real mistake of a lot of Western philosophy since the Enlightenment, is that it was all about the individual, the self-agent thinking for themselves, therefore I am, ... Well, all communal cultures in the history of the human race, anthropologically, we are communal. We are not these divided individuals as foremost. That is only a very recent configuration and an idea, and its time is overdone. We have to get back to the communal. So that's me as a Westerner. You in the East may say, wow, we've always been communal here. And I'm going, yeah, you probably have. And so that's why you're great leaders, in my opinion, for how to get back to. So in other words, fear dissolves quickly. It heals well when you're getting good attention from another human being. That's why we go to counselors, therapists, gurus, teachers, ministers, priests. There's reasons we do that, because there's something healing in having another witness you in your struggles, in your fears, and not judge you for them. That would be fundamental as a practice. Find your peers, find people who want to talk and share these kinds of things. And there's all kinds of peer ways to do that. You don't have to always go to professionals. So I train people in how to actually do peer liberation counseling. And that's just one of the things I do. But we all can find that in our lives. And a lot of us find it. We find it with a sister or an auntie or whatever, right? There's people we find. But it's hard to find people who can do it well. Thanks today for this talk, Ramala.
Thank you so much.
Look forward to your future work. Let's keep in contact and look forward to the viewers today. Put your comments in the conversation below. I'll put this up on our YouTube channel and see you soon.
Yes. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.